Today, I'd like to continue our discussion of joy, looking at it from both the Buddhist perspective, as exemplified by the teachings of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism, and the Christian perspective, taking a look at it through the eyes of Bishop Desmond Tutu, who worked so tirelessly to bring freedom to the people of South Africa. The Dalai Lama tells a story in terms of dealing with joy in difficult circumstances and how we can really achieve a certain spiritual level of joy even in the most incredibly adverse circumstances in our lives. And the story is of a monk from Tibet, a Buddhist monk, who was imprisoned in a Chinese prison camp. Very difficult circumstances, very little food, uh, dealing with cold, very, very harsh circumstances. And in reflecting on that experience of dealing with the prison camp, he talked about his greatest danger. What was his greatest danger in terms of being faithful to his mission as a monk? And it's interesting what he picked for his greatest danger. It wasn't a physical danger. It wasn't cold. It wasn't lack of food. It wasn't torture. None of that was what he considered himself to be his greatest danger. What he said was his greatest danger was losing compassion for his guards. So those people that were guarding him, in a way, they were reduced in their humanity as well. You might say, well, it is the prisoner who has the more difficult circumstance because he's got all those physical things that he has to deal with, and it can be very challenging, very difficult for him to survive. But that wasn't his concern. He looked into the eyes and the soul of those who were guarding him and realized what was happening to them as well. And he tried to develop compassion for them because guards in that situation face a very difficult problem themselves in terms of dealing with their humanity, what it means for them to be human beings. Some who survived the torture in the Chinese prison camps reported to the Dalai Lama that it was their best time for developing spiritual practice. So in those very difficult circumstances where they were being tortured, they had to rely on what? They had to rely on their spiritual strength. They had to rely on their practices of meditation. They had to rely on their ability to forgive and to be understanding. And they had to develop themselves in a very full and complete spiritual way that sometimes we don't have to develop as much when we live a life where we aren't challenged, where we aren't faced with a lot of adversity. In Buddhism, the expression is that you pass through suffering. Suffering is never seen as anything permanent. Sometimes we get all upset about, well, this is so difficult, this suffering is so horrible. But in the Buddhist way of looking at it, there is no suffering that is going to last forever, that is permanent. Suffering will come, suffering will go. And what is most important is the interior practices that we have developed in terms of dealing with that suffering. Shantideva, the famous Buddhist monk and scholar, talks very interestingly about a concept called the virtues of suffering. And you might think that this is very crazy. Virtues of suffering. How can suffering have a virtue or help to develop virtue? Suffering is something that we want to avoid. We don't want to get involved with suffering at all. So what is Shantideva talking about in terms of virtue and suffering? Well, Shantideva says, what happens when you suffer? First of all, your arrogance falls away. Let's face it, most of us can be very arrogant. We can feel that we're superior, we're better. We can take that type of uh, attitude towards other people, that attitude of superiority. And when you're suffering, all of a sudden, no more arrogance. You have been reduced uh, in your life. And so it's a whole different story. Also, what happens when you face suffering in terms of virtue is that you develop compassion for others who suffer. Sometimes we can ignore the sufferings of others, or be indifferent to the sufferings of others. We see that a lot in our contemporary situation with migrants. People don't want anything to do with them. They want them shipped out of the country. It's too much. But, well, wait a minute. Do you have compassion for their suffering? Do you understand what they're going through? And of course, many people might answer, maybe I do, but I don't want them here. They're here illegally. It's not a good thing. It's too expensive. They might create a crime. Terrorists might commit. There's all sorts of pros and cons one can have about that, and that's understandable. But when you take a step back, you say, well, are we being compassionate for those that are suffering? Maybe it's a lack of suffering ourselves. Maybe we can't relate to it because we've never been through it. We've never been in that situation where we face difficulties in our homeland, where there was lawlessness and where my life was being threatened. All of those terrible situations, well, maybe we never faced them. So maybe we don't understand them. Maybe we don't want to know about them. Maybe we just don't want to be compassionate towards that type of suffering. But then again, maybe there's other types of suffering we're very compassionate towards. So this development of compassion, Shantideva says, has something to do with our suffering. And the final virtue of suffering that Shantideva speaks about is that we learn to avoid actions that will bring suffering to others. So if there's something that I'm doing that is causing a suffering to another person, I'm upsetting them in some way, I'm troubling them, I'm not being sensitive to them, I want to avoid that because I myself experience suffering. I know what it's like. And the last thing I want to do is to put suffering upon another human being. Shantideva talks about this in terms of the virtues of suffering, something that we might not realize, that there can be development of virtues in suffering.